evening and welcome to another edition of A Conversation with John Conenna. Tonight, we have Chris Tye from CBS 2 Chicago, Sunday night anchor, and one of the better reporters out there in CBS land, in my opinion. Chris, I truly thank you for coming on here tonight. And I have to start off by saying, what is going on these days, young man?
Oh, well, thanks a lot for those kind words. I'm happy to be here, thrilled to be asked. There's never a lull. There's always something that is keeping us busy. And this weekend, one of the big stories is this grenade that went off inside of a home in Northwest Indiana.
Oh, wow.
Some relatives were going through some belongings of an older relative, I believe, who had passed, and it detonated in the house, killed a man. And it's, the contours of the story are terribly sad. But in addition to that, we're enjoying some nice weather. We're trying to cover and try to offer our viewers a balance, of what's going on, and also some uplift. And we work hard to make sure we try to get both of that across.
And Chris, amazing how you said that. There's always, something going on. I always kind of turn around and tell my family, what's the next episode that's going to happen? Whether it be what you had just said, and it's just the constant changes. I'm sure that, and of course, you had just reminded me, just in case, we might have to tinker with our time here tonight, because who knows what happens in 15 minutes from now.
Absolutely. Right? You never know. There could be somebody walking behind me in 5 minutes saying, come on, we got to go and do
we got to
this.
go.
But right. We're good for now. Happy to dive into whatever you want to chat about, John.
Question for you. You're the Oak Park native, not too far from, I'm the native of Norwich, Illinois.
Oh, yeah, sure. I used to go to the Norwich movie theaters, were our theaters there on Harlem. We'd go see the movies there. We go to Harlem Irving Plaza, Rolling Stone record store, all of it.
All right. So then you were in some good part of Norwich there.
Yes.
How does it start for you, Chris? I mean, with in the sense of the journalism, did you like it? Like, was it out of high school? Was it when you got to the university? I know you went to the university there of John Carroll. But how does it start for you, where you start to say, okay, I would like to, I'm enjoying this?
Yeah, I'll tell you, it goes way back beyond any of that. I knew when I was 6-7 years old that I had an interest in this line of work. I would do fake weather forecasts on the living room wall. I think I always enjoyed being the first to know something and kind of crafting a story around it. I enjoyed the performance part of the TV part of it. I enjoyed the deep dive journalism component of it that CBS 2 really underlines and highlights beautifully. I mean, we really have prioritized before I got here, but the original reporting, trying to find an investigative angle on all the stories that we do to try to take it beyond what's at surface level.
That's a great point by you, because I really try to dabble, let's say, with 2, 5, 7, and 9 still. I'm just the old school guy who watches those stations when it comes to the news. I'm not going to watch the CNN or, the Fox. So you're right. I feel 2 is more of the investigative style. Does it start out when you leave John Carroll, right? You're up in Michigan, right, at that time, I think.
Yeah, so my trail went from, I graduated Oak Park River Forest High School. I went to John Carroll, which is in suburban Cleveland. I did the whole apply at all the small markets. I kind of wanted to stay, I'm really close to my family. I wanted to stay reasonably geographically close. And the goal was always to come home to Chicago. So my theory of the case was, find local small markets, maybe within 200 miles, of Chicago as best I could. So I applied for jobs in Terre Haute, Indiana, in Sioux City, Iowa, and then Traverse City, Michigan. And I ended up going to Traverse City as my first job. I was there for a year. Was
that at WPBN?
Yeah, TV 7 and 4, which the market, the country is split up into about 220 TV markets. Number 1 is New York and LA, then Chicago, and on and on and on. And Traverse City was like market 125 at the time. I always, whenever I talk to classes, when I go talk to journalism classes, I talk about how in small markets, you don't have the luxury of a robust news cycle like we have in Chicago, and you have to make things that might not otherwise be interesting. Hey, John, we're going to send you to the Leelanau County road salt budget meeting because they're going to increase the salt budget for this winter when we get 100 inches of snow. Go
Okay,
and make that story interesting and try
right,
to get people not to watch The Daily Show or HBO. We want them to watch our local news, and you got to make that story interesting.
sure.
Journalism is about telling truths, but also you want to compel people to watch your product and tell them why the story is important to their life.
So
And
can I
yeah,
ask you? I'll stop you right there because I get a little frustrated because sometimes, tomorrow some weatherman says we're going to have 20 inches of snow. Watch out, and then all of a sudden you get flurries. But do you feel like when you were doing those markets, you had to put a little bit of sensationalism to it?
it wasn't sensationalism. It was more about if let's just take that example, that very random example that I just brought up about road salt. Let's
Yeah,
say you are a veterinary hospital at the top of a steep road in northern Michigan, and if your road isn't salted properly, people won't be able to get to your facility in the heart of winter to properly give their animal care, or a human
right,
doctor's office. Those people you can find a way to make the road salt budget story interesting without being sensational. You just have to find the human beings who have a stake in it. And so it's not as much about sensationalism. It's really about trying to find a creative way to tell a story. I mean, when we're talking about public tax dollars, and in that part of the country where snow is a major piece of what they deal with all of the time.
right.
Similarly, if you were probably down in South Texas, there's probably an inverse example for heat. But, my job was to go and tell stories about, things that affect the folks in northern Michigan. And you really had to get creative. And so it did forced me to learn how to find characters, take data and make it sort of come alive to
Sure.
show, hey, here's why this is important. Last year, you know John's veterinary clinic lost 12 days of business because people couldn't get to the place,
Got
and
it.
so these are the animals that didn't get the care that they needed. And so that may, you could argue, I suppose, that there is some sensationalistic nature to it, but there really is a human nature, and you're trying to drill down and try to find those stories. And so you have to really be, you're assigned a story at 9:30 in the morning. It has to be on the air at 5 that afternoon,
Right.
or you're coming at 2 and you have to be on at 10 o'clock, or in the Eastern time zone, 11 o'clock. You have to make something pretty quick, but you have standards that you want to meet. And for me, I always try to steer away from the sensationalistic and really try and find the compelling characters of a topic and let them tell their story. Through our eyes and through our cameras and microphones.
You know, I'm sure when you did these stories back at the smaller stations, the next day when they be saying, okay, well, the one about the rolled salt didn't go that well, or the one
Right.
about the rolled salt, holy cow, we got the calls, or whatever the term was, the terminology was back then. Oh my God, you should see our ratings tonight. The way, Chris has reported this story. Did you get a lot of feedback at the onset of your career?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I think when you are dealing with people who are a year out of college, or in my case, not even a full year out of college, you are learning as you go. I'm not going to tell you how little I made on that first job, but the way I look at it in my brain is it was glorified graduate school.
Right.
They paid me a very basic sum of money to come up there and take a crash course in how to do this for a living. And I think for a lot of people, it's also sort of a quick litmus test of, do I want to do this for a living? Do I want to be telling road salt budget stories in Traverse City, Michigan,
Right.
while the rest of my friends might be working at an advertising agency in Chicago, making a whole lot more money and having a more dynamic life? I mean, television, it still is this way. There is sacrifice for people to go out and kind of earn their their credibility and hone their skills. And so yeah, I had bosses that would come in. We would go out for beers after the newscast with our competitive stations and say, what did you get, how did you do this? And so you really, and to some degree it still applies today, I think about the viewer first and foremost. But then I think about my bosses and I think about my competitors and
Oh,
what do
sure.
they think? And I think about my family. They watch and I share their name. And so I want to do good by them. And you kind of start to drill down into a smaller focus group of people that you're kind of doing this for. Obviously the public is the thrust of it, but for how you carry yourself, how you comport yourself, how you tell truths, that's always kind of been my guidepost. But yes, I definitely got feedback along the way from a lot of bosses
And
and
this
colleagues.
was your goal. I mean, you know that you could progress onward and onward from these little stations,
I
correct?
had hoped. I mean, there was no assurances that would happen.
Excuse me.
And I mean, I think back to the people that I came up with in my first couple of markets, the percentage of people that are probably still in it, and this is not a credit to me, but it's kind of more of a reality of the business. Uh, I'd say 8 out of 10 are out of TV. I mean, things happen. People start families.
Sure. Yeah.
Television is a very, very demanding lifestyle. You have to work really bizarre hours. A lot of times work holidays, and people don't always love that. And it's what's called for.
I learned something. I thought you guys would like say you're going to be on the 10 o'clock tonight. I learned
Mhm.
something. I thought you were going into the studio. This was a few years back at 9:30. I just read a script. This is an all-day event with
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
preparation and
yeah,
everything else.
when you're the analogy I always use is when you're anchoring a show, you're in charge of carrying the 30 minutes and you have to know it inside and out in case something goes wrong. You have to be read in on the stories that are bubbling because something could break. You have to really be comfortable with a whole lot of things. When you're reporting, you spend, the entirety of your day immersed in that one topic and you need to become kind of a quick expert on it. So those both require, a full day's work and in many cases, days and days of work.
Right. It could lead into like even the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Exactly. Exactly.
Mhm.
Um, what was the first after the smaller stations? What was that first one that where you got this job and you said, okay, I'm Chris Tye. Okay, they're starting to realize or they start to see my progression. What was that first station where you started to make that jump where it was almost like CBS to Chicago?
Mm. So after Traverse City, my next job was actually geographically the next market to the south. So I went from Traverse City to Grand Rapids, and I was there at the ABC station there for about 4.5 years. I was there for, I kind of think about some of the big benchmark moments. When I first moved to Chicago, about 6 months into Chicago, COVID happened. About a year into Grand Rapids, 9/11 happened.
Right.
And those are the moments where viewers turn to local news in ways that are much more dynamic and much more compelling and it's relationship building. People say during COVID, people were all at home and they wanted to
Right.
hear what Governor Pritzker and Dr. Ezike had to say every day. And we were, for better or worse, the gatekeepers try to tell people, here's where things are at. Here's the temperature check. Here's where the numbers are at. Here's what the restrictions are on the books right now. So in Grand Rapids, for me, that was 9/11. It was the big story, and everybody in television at that point dealt with that. And in that market, you had to be a little bit. There was a little more news than in Traverse City, but it's still, I told you the list of there's 220 markets. Traverse City was 120, Grand Rapids was 38, and it was a different, you know, the contours of each TV market are kind of unique. There's the political winds that blow. What do
Right.
people want? What kind of news works? What kind of news is naturally happening there? If you're in a market that happens to be a state capital, it's you kind of have a bloodline of content to cover that maybe you wouldn't have elsewhere. Or if you're in, Detroit, you have the auto industry that you can bank on. In Florida, you
Sure.
have, tourism stories that you might cover. Big college towns, you have stuff like that. So each market kind of has its own ways of demanding certain kinds of content from the local TV stations.
Chris, were you always reporting and also doing like in the anchor? Were you doing both? Was it always that way?
No, in Traverse City, I did no anchoring. I was a reporter. In Grand Rapids, I was the same. I was a full-time reporter. I did some feature reporting, and then I did a lot of breaking news and storytelling. In that market, they really prioritized storytelling. They were very much about human interest stories. People wanted to feel good. Um, and sometimes it's a byproduct of what the television station management or the consultants that sometimes advise television stations, hey, here's our position ratings wise in the market. We think our best strategy to, elevate our product, elevate our revenue, for lack of a better term, is to plant our flag in this lane. And so the
Right.
station I was at was much more about, for lack of a better term, maybe a little softer news. People want to feel good about where they
Good.
live. So then I was there, and then I moved to Cleveland. I don't want to get ahead of your questions, but I
No, no,
moved to
no.
Cleveland, and in Cleveland, I was a reporter for about 3 or 4 years, and then I did every other than the main 6 and 11 job. I did every anchoring position there. I was the morning anchor for a time. I was the weekend anchor for a time. I was the 7 o'clock anchor for a time. I touched them all. So that's where I really kind of transitioned to, refining the anchoring skill set a little bit, such as it is.
Well, I mean, even to watch you, because sometimes during the week, I'm all watching the channels. You're so well rounded, and the experience that you have is just amazing because you have touched on a lot of different things, and I'm sure, like you said, from the onset to now, all these markets and getting here to CBS Chicago is just amazing. I'm sure how you felt. How was it, not to kind of jump ahead, but how was it to come back to Chicago,
Oh,
being the Oak Park,
yeah.
native?
It was a dream come true. I mean, I still don't take for granted being home. I mean, you talk to a lot of people in the media in what you do, and I've always said this, and I don't know what your opinion on this would be, but growing up in a market like this, where it's the faucet of news is robust. It is fast moving, and so you have to, in local news, kind of synthesize in real time. Okay, there's 10 things happening. What must we cover? What should we cover? What can't, you have to kind of do this game of Jenga and kind of
Right.
pick and choose and make your decisions. Um, but growing up here, the people I grew up listening to, Bob Collins was always on the
Oh,
radio from
Channel 9.
WGN Radio, or Ron Majors was the main anchor at Channel 7. I think about people like Harry Porterfield telling amazing
Oh, yeah.
stories of someone you
Someone you
should
should know.
know.
Yeah.
I think about all of these things. Felicia Middlebrooks on WDBM Radio, all these people that had amazing knowledge bases, amazing storytelling skills, and a great composure, the way they comported themselves. And that always stood with me. And I think Chicagoans are, at least people who do what I do for a living, if you grow up in this environment, you breathe in that air, you listen to those voices, you watch those journalists do their job, your baseline of what's expected of the profession is different than if you grew up in Lansing, Michigan, or if you grew up in,
Right.
San Luis Obispo, California. You just probably wouldn't be privy to that caliber of talent that kind of made you say, I mean, I interned at the Loop radio station where Kevin Matthews, Stephen Gary, Johnny
Sure.
Brandmeier, and they were doing revelatory radio. No one was doing this anywhere in the country. And that would just kind of be the radio station for, you know, for really kind of raucous humor, and you
Exactly.
learned how to tell a joke. You learned how to
Right.
tell a story. You listened to them. I would do some radio in college, and I would come in with all of these ideas because the air that I ingested was people doing it at a remarkably high level. And so that always, I think, in the back of my head, helped me give me a leg up on it all. And even like Rob Feeder, who covered the beat
Oh,
forever and
wow.
ever, he would give us the playbook of what's, you get to know who the bosses of these stations were. They were
Right.
covering media like it was a baseball team, and you got to look behind the curtain and realize this isn't just somebody on television.
Sure.
These are people who have contracts, and here's the state of this person's contract, and here's how much the contract's for. And you're like, wow, I don't think people in most parts of the country have that much of a read in on what's going on in their market.
Exactly. Oh my God, you have touched on so many things. I was getting goosebumps here while you were saying some of the names because, yeah, those experiences, like you said, just from those gentlemen that you mentioned. I interviewed Paul Meineke, And I think, I don't know what, I forget the state he was coming from. And I says, how was it, Paul, to come to Chicago? He goes, God, when I walked in that Channel 7 studio, I was nervous. He goes,
Paul came from Cleveland. Paul
yeah,
was at WEWS in Cleveland. He went to Channel 7. He's one of the gold standards. I mean,
right.
I mean, you probably talked with him about it. I mean, he was the one called in on at least one or two police standoffs where he was brought in because the suspect trusted him.
Yes. Yes. But Chris, again, I remember him saying, just like you said, I walk in that newsroom and the talent that was there,
Oh my gosh.
so like an all-star team. I want to touch on something that I didn't know about you. There's three things, because I know your time is valuable here tonight, because I know you're going to be, I don't want to take up a lot of your time, but there were three things that came up when I was doing the research on you. One, when the story broke of the foster children being shackled by the Illinois Department of Children's Services, kind of your reporting kind of changed the format for them, didn't it?
Yeah, I covered the Department of Children and Family Services pretty doggedly for a number of years. I still do. And we would get tips, and one of our bosses here will, one of the mantras is a tip is the lifeblood of a newsroom. When somebody calls you and says, hey, we have something that we think you should investigate, and we have a history of proving it out, that when the tips come in, we will stop what we're doing and we will look into it and we will dive into it. And we got some tips that kids were being shackled, and they were being shackled as they were being transported sometimes 6, 8, 9 hours outside of the area. And so we found out that it was going on, that it was, not standard practice, but it was being allowed to happen. And so we did some reporting on it. A state representative saw our reporting on it, and it did lead to some law changes in the state.
To the changes. And the other one that really caught my eye was the one about the Social Security.
Right.
During the, I think that wasn't that during the pandemic.
Yeah, right. There were people that were stealing Social Security numbers, and then Social Security numbers were being mailed out to people who they shouldn't be getting them. And so the state stopped. There were certain occasions under which the state would print out a Social Security number and name in full, and then it would accidentally get mailed out to the wrong person. It was happening in duplicative fashion. And so our reporting, IDES, the Illinois Department of Employment Services, stopped that practice based on our reporting.
And Chris, that was great reporting, because at that time during the COVID, it was an absolute mess. You couldn't get through to them.
Right.
Emails, you name it, no form of technology could get through to that IDS. It was
listen, I mean, the pandemic created problems that no one, could have foreseen. But our job was to really kind of survey the landscape and find out where are the really egregious problems going on, because there were scammers that were trying to, capitalize on that moment in time. And so I think our reporting did some good there.
I got to ask you, probably one of the first times I saw you reporting was the Kenosha. That was something, because that was a very scary time, because now this is leading to riots all over. You were in the trenches there, weren't you, in Kenosha? Could you?
Yeah, the story in Kenosha, which was, the first summer of COVID, and it was happening in August or September. It was just stiflingly hot, and we were all wearing masks. I remember that just from affecting it myself. But the story, the thing about the Kenosha unrest that really struck me was it began as a police officer pullover story, and then it became a police officer fatally shooting a gentleman, and then it became a civil, it became a civil rights issue, and there were marches, and then it became a story of civil unrest. You had people coming in feeling that the police needed to be backed up, and so you had these, sort of militias, for lack of a better term, which we saw some of these organizations bubble back up on January 6th. A number of the names that we heard, the Proud Boys were in Kenosha before they were in Washington, D.C. in that form. And then it became a political story, because both Joe Biden and Donald Trump went to Kenosha in short order right before the election. And so the story morphed. It became 3 or 4 different stories that kind of all had overlapping through lines to them. So that was definitely one that was really important for us to get right.
Chris, was Kenosha after George Floyd or before George Floyd?
It was after George Floyd.
It was there. So
Yeah.
this now it was a continual spiral
Yes.
during the call. But again, it's the way you reported it. Again, where that viewer, the listener, is learning to know the right way to learn this. And again, there I thought there wasn't a lot of sensationalism. You were reporting straightforward news.
Right. Yeah. I mean, listen, there's a place and time for people who want opinion. That's great. There are plenty of ways to do that. But I think there's fewer and fewer places that people can turn to. And listen, there is no such thing, I suppose, as true objectivity. I mean, who we choose to interview for a story is inherently biased. If we choose to interview you or your neighbor about the car accident in front of your house, you know, there's your eyes saw X and their eyes saw Y and we chose X. And so, but we're trying to call balls and strikes as reasonably as we can, and suss out what is exactly going on, and trying to be in real time. Social media is full of misinformation, and if we can kind of steer clear of that, we'd rather be second and right than first and wrong.
Well, again, like I always tell a lot of my friends and family, a lot of people tell me, I don't watch the news. What do you mean you don't watch the news? Maybe you're watching or streaming something like you just said that is wrong, or it's not right. And
Right.
question for you, what do you prefer to do? Like investigative reporting, or because it looks like you can do both. You're like that sixth man out there where you can do the news like you're going to night the Sunday night anchor here with CBS, or the reporting. What do you think is your forte?
I when there's a big breaking story, I definitely like being on the front end of that.
Oh, wow.
I think when it comes to trying to process what's going on, and kind of being on the front edge of it, I very much enjoy that. It goes back to what I was telling you about, being the first to know something, and trying to get it right. Um, but I also do enjoy, some deeper dive stuff. I like doing profile pieces. We got to do some pieces on the new mayor a couple of weeks ago, where we talked to some really smart people who knew or know him, and have analyzed him in some really interesting ways. So I do like to sometimes take my foot out of the day-to-day news cycle, and be able to do some deeper dive profiles and investigative stuff. But thankfully, they at CBS2 have been nice enough to let me kind of do a little anchoring, do a little deeper dive reporting. And then, of course, the Daily Machine requires a lot of our attention too.
And Chris, you don't know again from day to day what is going to happen or what's coming up next, right? You just don't know.
Oh, no, I mean, so tonight I'll work until 11 o'clock. Dana and I will anchor the news till 11. I'll go to bed, and tomorrow at 2 o'clock, I'll be on an afternoon meeting where we're talking about what story they want me on to
Wow.
report for Monday's night news. And there'll be certain stories, if something clear and present occurs, there's kind of, there's going to be, everybody's going to cover maybe the big story of the day. And
Sure.
then, each station kind of has a little bit of wiggle room. I like to think of them as kind of elective classes. You've got to take your core, but there's electives. And so what we do on our
Sure.
meetings is we pitch, hey, I think it really would be interesting to go and do a story about metro ridership, say, because traffic in Chicago is getting bonkers again. The Kennedy's under construction. What about we take a look at Metros now has standing room only on almost every train in rush hour that didn't happen a month ago. Do we have to do that story tomorrow at 10 o'clock? No, but I might be pitching that. And I think that's kind
Sure.
of an interesting story that has wide resonance, and there's a trend line that's happening. So, but over at Channel 5, they might be on the same meeting, and somebody else pitches, hey, I think we need to be doing something about the summer cold that's going around with everybody. And
Right.
is one right? Is one wrong? That's in the eye of the beholder and the viewer.
Exactly. Well, listen, I want to close it up with a couple things.
Yeah.
And again, I truly, truly thank you for coming on.
Oh, my
Especially,
pleasure. My
this was
pleasure.
great. I have to tell you, I mean, you have won regional Emmy Awards. Of course, a guy that when I was a young boy growing up in Norwich, I think he was at the tail end of his career. Of course, Mr. the Edward R. Murrow Award. I still remember his show, replays of that show. I mean, those are honors of honors that you have received. And that is something, when I saw that, especially the Regional Emmy Awards and the Edwin R. Murrow Award. I mean, you talk about the gold standard. That is the gold standard. And my friend, you are the gold standard over at CBS. Your delivery and how you do it is, it caught my attention right away a couple of years ago. And I always said to myself, I hope I can have a chance to interview you. So,
well, thanks. That's very kind of you. I really, you know, you've talked to a lot of the best of the best. I know you've talked to my colleagues, Dana and Jim.
yeah, Dana and Jimmy.
And I hold them in such high regard. They really enjoyed their time talking with you. So thank you for that. That is terribly kind.
I'm going to leave you with 5 questions. And
Okay.
one-word answers, elaborate on them or not. Who was that early mentor that you said, I want to be like this guy again? Who was that first early mentor?
You mean the person who helped me personally, or the person I aspired to be like?
Aspired.
I would probably say, I would say Ron Majors, or I really also enjoyed listening to Paul Harvey, who was not far from where I grew up, and I thought his way of telling stories was really compelling. So I'd say Paul Harvey and Ron Majors.
And I got to tell you, Chris, you remind me a little bit of Majors.
When
Majors
from your
was
mouth
on
to
5
God's
with
ear.
Daryl Marini. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. The interview that you still haven't done, and it can't be me.
Fair.
Who's the interview that if you could interview somebody right now?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, we talked about this earlier, the Department of Children and Family Services, the boss of the Department of Children and Family Services. I have a long list of questions. We have a lot of stories that we still think. But I mean, as far as kind of a, you know, I think it would be really interesting to, you know, over my TV markets, there would be different people. So in Cleveland, for example, there were those girls who were held captive for 10 or 12 years in that basement. Remember that story? I don't know if you remember that story. I covered that closely. So those girls, I just covered their story for a long, long time. Interviewing one of them would be something for me personally, if case of my career, but probably someone like in Chicago, at least, would probably be the head of DCFS to probably get to make some news. I feel like we could make some news on that interview.
That's Chris, third question, favorite all-time movie of all time?
Favorite all-time movie of all time
that you can watch over and over again?
Yeah, I mean, I probably have the answer that so many people say, but it's the Shawshank Redemption. I could watch that.
Best.
I could watch that a lot, and I have.
That is a great movie. That is a great movie. All right, we're gonna get it down to the last 2. Your favorite Chicago pizza?
Oh, that's a good one. So I grew up with I don't know if you know Jim and Pete's. It's on North
Avenue.
That's really good pizza.
Very good.
I would you know, I think it's Vito and Nick's down on Pulaski and like 70th. They always win.
Oh, wow.
We had a CBS 2 pizza off, and it was Lou Malnati's versus Vito and Nick's. It's really, if you're ever going around Midway Airport, it's about 12 miles south of Midway, and it's
okay. I'm gonna have to try it.
Because
you know, me being Italian, I'm gonna have to put that one on. And then the last one, this might be a tough one for you. Cubs or Sox, being the Oak Park native?
I know. Well, my sister married a diehard White Sox fan, but we live close to Wrigley, so I'm gonna say my son's favorite song in the world is "Go Cubs Go," so I have to go with the Cubs. I know I can tell that you are a South Side Sox fan, but I've got to be honest. I'm not going to end this interview about journalistic integrity and lie to you.
Chris, I really mean it. Chris Tye, keep doing what you're doing. Fantastic work at CBS. This was an honor for me to have you on, and I hope we can meet somewhere down the road again.
I'd love it. Thanks, John, for asking. I really appreciate it, and I really enjoyed it.
And I'll be watching you tonight.
Thank you, sir.
You got it. Take care.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.